He thought she was just a normal black woman, that he could threaten like any other black woman. Until she walked into court and shocked him, and his career was ruined. Nashville, Tennessee. A late night, the highway stretched empty, only the occasional rumble of semi-trucks rolling through the darkness. A light drizzle coated the asphalt, reflecting the golden glow of the streetlights. Raindrops trickled down the windshield, the rhythmic swish of the wipers blending with the soft jazz playing through the car speakers. Alexandra Carter leaned back slightly in her seat, one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel. She had been driving for nearly 2 hours, eager to get home after a long day. No endless meetings, no stacks of reports, just her, the open road, and the soothing hum of music. Then suddenly, flashing red and blue lights lit up her rearview mirror. A patrol car closed in fast, sirens blaring for her to pull over. Alexandra's eyebrows knitted together. Her military instincts kicked in, running through a mental checklist: speed limit. Check. Lane position. Check. Everything was in order. There was no legitimate reason for this stop. She took a slow breath, flipped on her signal, and eased the car onto the shoulder. Turning off the engine, she placed both hands visibly on the steering wheel. Growing up in a military family, she knew exactly how to handle these situations. Compliance didn't guarantee safety, but it minimized risk. The patrol car's door creaked open, and from the shadows emerged a figure. John Miller stepped out, moving deliberately, his presence heavy with authority. His boots scuffed against the wet pavement as he approached, one hand resting near his belt, close to his holstered weapon. The beam of his flashlight cut through the drizzle, blindingly bright as it swept across her windshield. No greeting, no explanation. His voice came out flat, cold, commanding. License and registration. Alexandra didn't react immediately. Through the rearview mirror, she studied his stance, the look in his eyes a familiar kind, one she had encountered before. With measured calm, she reached into the glove compartment, retrieving her documents before extending them through the open window. "Officer, may I ask what I did wrong?" John didn't answer right away. He flipped through her paperwork, barely glancing at it, before his lips curled into a smirk. "Tail lights out." Alexandra frowned. That couldn't be right. The light drizzle continued, painting a thin sheen over the asphalt. The streetlights flickered against the damp pavement, casting long, distorted shadows. Inside her car, Alexandra Carter kept her posture relaxed but alert, both hands still resting lightly on the steering wheel. Through the rearview mirror, she observed John Miller, his stance, the way he held his flashlight slightly too long on her face, the unspoken arrogance in the way he carried himself. "Tail lights out," he said, his tone flat, devoid of explanation. Alexandra narrowed her eyes slightly. She knew that wasn't true. Just 2 weeks ago, her vehicle had undergone routine maintenance. The taillights were checked. Everything was in working order. She kept her voice steady. "Would you mind showing me where it's out?" John tilted his head, his smirk deepening, as if amused by the question. "I don't have to show you anything. Step out of the car." Alexandra felt the shift in the air. This wasn't about a broken taillight. This was about control. She inhaled slowly, keeping her movements deliberate. Every fiber of her military-trained instincts told her this was the moment where compliance wouldn't matter, where logic wouldn't change the course he had already decided. "I have the right to know why I'm being asked to step out of my vehicle," she said, her tone measured, respectful, but firm. John stepped closer, his boots grinding against the wet pavement. His voice dropped, colder now. "Because I said so." The silence stretched. Only the faint sound of rain tapping against the windshield filled the space between them. Alexandra could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. No witnesses, no cameras. Just her and a man with a badge who believed his word was law. She let out a slow breath. "I'm not refusing, officer. I'm simply asking for clarification." John let out a short, humorless laugh. "You really want to go down this road?" Before she could respond, he lifted his radio to his mouth. Voice clipped, calculated. "Dispatch, I've got a non-compliant driver. Might need backup." Alexandra's grip on the steering wheel tightened briefly before she released it. She knew exactly what he was doing, escalating the situation, painting her as the aggressor before she even had a chance to react. but she wouldn't give him the reaction he wanted. With deliberate movements, she reached for the door handle, pushed it open, and stepped out into the cool night air. She stood tall, her expression unreadable, meeting his gaze without hesitation. John scanned her from head to toe, assessing her, calculating just how far he could push. "Turn around, hands on the car." She didn't move immediately. "Am I under arrest?" John's eyes darkened. He took another step forward. "You want to keep pushing me?" The space between them felt impossibly tense, like a rubber band stretched too tight. Alexandra knew this was the moment that defined what came next. She exhaled slowly, then turned, placing her hands flat against the roof of her car. This wasn't over, and John Miller had no idea what he had just set in motion. The cold metal of the car roof pressed against Alexandra's palms as she stood still, rain lightly misting her skin. Her breathing remained steady, her posture relaxed, but inside a slow, controlled anger simmered beneath the surface. She had seen this before. She had heard the stories, watched the footage, read the reports. A cop with unchecked authority. A stop that should have been routine, but wasn't. A moment where everything could shift in an instant. Behind her, John Miller lingered, his presence heavy, deliberate. She could hear the scrape of his boots against the wet pavement, the way he took his time like he was savoring the control. "Stay still," he ordered, voice low and assertive. Alexandra didn't move, but she could feel him inch closer, too close. His breath was hot against the damp air, his presence pressing in like an invisible weight. "I have the right to know exactly why I'm being detained," she said, keeping her tone neutral but firm. John let out a short chuckle, sharp, mocking. "You have the right to do as you're told." A familiar silence stretched between them, the kind that came before escalation, the kind where one side expected the other to fold. Then suddenly she felt it, his hand gripping her wrist, yanking it behind her back with unnecessary force. The cold steel of the cuffs snapped around her wrist, biting into her skin. Too tight, deliberately so. "You're under arrest for obstruction," John declared, satisfaction clear in his voice. Alexandra inhaled through her nose, controlled, measured. Not fear calculation. "Obstruction?" she repeated, her voice steady. "For what? Asking a question?" John yanked her other arm back, locking the cuffs with a sharp click. "For not knowing when to keep your mouth shut," he muttered. Alexandra exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to push back. She had two choices: escalate or endure. She wasn't about to become another statistic. John shoved her forward, forcing her toward his patrol car. "You have no idea what you just did," she murmured as he pushed her into the back seat. John laughed as he slammed the door shut. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm doing." But he didn't. Not even close. The patrol car door slammed shut, sealing Alexandra inside the cramped, cold interior. The sharp plastic of the back seat pressed against her spine, and the cuffs dug into her wrists, the metal biting into her skin. She rolled her shoulders slightly, testing the restraints not because she expected them to give, but because she wanted to gauge just how tight John had made them. Outside, John Miller leaned against his car, one hand lazily resting on his belt, the other raising his radio to his mouth. "Non-compliant driver in custody. Transporting now." His voice was calm, self-satisfied. Alexandra watched him through the wire partition. He really thought he had won. He thought she was just another person he could intimidate, another case that would disappear under layers of bureaucracy and indifference. He had no idea how wrong he was. John was just about to slide into the driver's seat when his radio crackled again. This time, the voice on the other end sounded different, sharper, more urgent. "Miller, hold transport. We've got a situation." John frowned, pausing with one hand on the door handle. "What situation?" A beat of silence. Then, "We just got a call from higher up. They want to know why you arrested a high-ranking military officer without probable cause." John's entire posture changed. His grip on the door tightened, his jaw clenched. "What?" His voice wasn't as steady now. Inside the car, Alexandra allowed herself the faintest smirk. She didn't need to say anything. She didn't have to make a call. She knew the moment John made the mistake of taking her into custody, the right people would find out. The moment her name was processed, the moment someone checked her record, it was inevitable. John turned away from his car, stepping a few feet away as he pulled out his phone, dialing fast. His shoulders were stiff, movements no longer relaxed. From the other side of the lot, another officer approached, holding a clipboard. His steps were hesitant, and when he spoke, his voice carried uncertainty. "Sergeant Miller, we just got another directive. We're being told to release her immediately." John turned sharply, eyes narrowing. "Excuse me?" The officer hesitated. "This is coming from Central Command. They're requesting a full report, and they want access to your body cam footage." There it was, the moment of realization. John's face darkened, his fingers flexed, fists clenching at his sides. He knew. If the footage was reviewed, if an internal investigation was opened, he was done. He turned back toward the patrol car, his movements stiff, his once arrogant confidence now stripped away. He yanked the door open. "Get out," he muttered, his voice no longer carrying the same authority. Alexandra didn't move immediately. She tilted her head slightly, watching him. "You sure?" she asked, her voice calm, amused. John exhaled sharply, jaw tightening. "Just get out." With slow, deliberate movements, she stepped out of the vehicle, rolling her shoulders as circulation returned to her wrists. She could feel his frustration, his barely concealed rage, but there was nothing he could do about it. "Looks like this didn't go how you planned," she said, adjusting her sleeves. John said nothing. He just turned on his heel, storming away. And as Alexandra stood there, the night air cool against her skin, she knew this wasn't just about her anymore. This was about the system, and it was about to change. The courtroom carried a heavy stillness, the kind that made every footstep sound louder, every movement more deliberate. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long streaks across the polished wooden floors. Rows of spectators filled the seats, some whispering in hushed tones, others simply watching, waiting. Alexandra Carter sat at the defense table, her posture relaxed but composed. Beside her, her attorney, Catherine Monroe, calmly flipped through a stack of documents. The woman was methodical, precise, no wasted movements, no unnecessary words. Alexandra respected that. Across the room, John Miller sat stiffly, his hands clasped together, his jaw clenched. The arrogance he had once carried with him on that empty highway was gone. He avoided looking in Alexandra's direction. The judge, Alan Kirkland, entered, his expression unreadable. He adjusted his glasses, gave a tired sigh, and spoke. "Court is now in session." The prosecutor stood, his voice clear and measured. "Your Honor, today we are reviewing the unlawful detainment of Lieutenant Commander Alexandra Carter by Sergeant John Miller." A murmur rippled through the room. The case had drawn attention. Reporters, legal experts, community activists. The prosecutor continued, stepping toward the evidence screen. "Body cam footage and patrol car recordings indicate that Sergeant Miller conducted an unlawful stop and escalated the situation without cause. The defendant repeatedly requested an explanation, yet none was given before she was forcibly detained." The screen flickered to life. The room fell silent as the video played. John's voice came through first, sharp, commanding. "Step out of the car." "Why?" "Because I said so." Then came the footage of him tightening the handcuffs too aggressively, shoving Alexandra toward the patrol car, his smug expression visible in the reflection of the window. The courtroom remained quiet when the video ended. Judge Kirkland leaned forward, steepling his fingers. He turned to John, his voice measured. "Sergeant Miller, would you care to explain your actions?" John hesitated. His fingers twitched slightly on the table, but no words came. The prosecutor didn't wait. He lifted another document. Additionally, an internal review of Sergeant Miller's arrest history shows a disproportionate number of stops involving black drivers in this district. Another murmur swept through the crowd. John's face darkened. His attorney leaned in, whispering something, but he barely acknowledged her. Judge Kirkland sighed. "I don't like what I'm hearing." He set the case file down with finality. "The charges against Lieutenant Commander Carter are hereby dismissed." The gavel struck. "Furthermore, I strongly recommend an internal investigation into Sergeant Miller's conduct." The tension snapped like a pulled rubber band. John sat frozen. His career, his power, everything he had taken for granted was slipping through his fingers. Alexandra simply exhaled, controlled and steady. She had never doubted this outcome. She gathered her things, stood, and walked toward the exit. As she passed by John, their eyes met for the briefest moment. No words were exchanged. They didn't need to be, because this time, he was the one who had to fight for his reputation. A cool breeze swept across the courthouse steps as Alexandra Carter stepped outside. The morning sun cast a golden hue over the city, but the crisp air carried the weight of everything that had just unfolded inside. She inhaled deeply, feeling the moment settle in. It wasn't just her victory, it was a message. A statement that accountability was possible, that unchecked power wouldn't always go unchallenged. The murmurs of reporters broke through her thoughts. A cluster of journalists had gathered near the courthouse entrance, cameras flashing, microphones being raised. Lieutenant Commander Carter, any thoughts on today's ruling? She paused for a second, glancing at the faces before her. This wasn't just about her arrest. It was about the people who had been through the same ordeal, but never got their day in court. Keeping her voice steady, she answered, "Justice was served today, but justice shouldn't be something that depends on rank, connections, or luck. This case is not an isolated incident. It's part of a larger issue within law enforcement that needs to be addressed." Pens scribbled faster. Reporters leaned in. "Do you think Sergeant Miller will face further consequences?" Alexandra didn't react immediately. She had seen the look on his face when the ruling was handed down the moment he realized his power had been stripped away. Whether or not he would face charges, one thing was certain. He was no longer untouchable. "I believe those in positions of power should be held accountable for their actions," she said firmly. "No one is above the law." From the corner of her eye, she caught movement. "Carter!" She turned to see Colonel Reynolds standing a few feet away, arms crossed, watching her with an unreadable expression. As she approached, he gave a small nod. "The Department of Defense wants to speak with you. They're considering policy changes regarding incidents like this, and they want your input." She raised an eyebrow. "They want me to work with the system I just fought against?" Reynolds let out a dry chuckle. "They want you to help fix it." Alexandra exhaled. She had never sought the spotlight. She hadn't planned to become a symbol for reform, but if her voice could prevent someone else from going through what she had, maybe it was worth considering. She glanced around. Life in the city continued as usual. People walked, traffic moved, the world spun forward. But something had shifted. This wasn't just about her anymore. She met Reynolds' gaze and gave a small nod. "I'll think about it." And with steady steps, she walked away, knowing the fight wasn't over, it was just beginning. Power without accountability leads to abuse. Alexandra Carter's experience is not just her own, it's a reflection of a deeper systemic issue. This story is about resilience, justice, and the need for reform. No one should be judged or mistreated based on authorities' biases. True change begins when people stand up, demand answers, and refuse to be silenced. Justice should not depend on rank or status. It should be a fundamental right. If this story makes you think, talk about it. If it makes you angry, push for change. Because real progress starts with real conversations.